Welcome everyone to this Institution of Environmental Sciences, or IES, webinar, Interdisciplinary Climate Action, Making a Net Zero Society. This event has been organised by our climate action community as part of our activities during COP29, which of course kicked off today in Baku. I will post details about our climate action community shortly in the chat box, but before that I wanted to introduce our speaker for today. So we're really pleased today to be joined by Professor Patrick Devine-Wright. Patrick is an environmental social scientist at the University of Exeter. He is Director of Access, an ESRC-funded project which champions the contribution of the social sciences to address and solve environmental problems. Patrick's primary interest is the social acceptance of energy transitions, community engagement, and place attachment. He was an IPCC lead author on social aspects of climate mitigation in AR6 and sits on the Devon Climate Task Force. As usual, the presentation will be followed by a Q&A at the end, so please do use the Q&A function, which you should see at the bottom of your screen, and you can post questions in that throughout the presentation, and I will then read them out on your behalf later on. A massive thank you to you, Patrick, for presenting today. I'll hand over to you.
Cheers. Thank you very much, Anthony. Right, off we go, and thank you very much for the invitation. And as you can see from the title slide, I'm going to talk today about interdisciplinary climate action. And in that sense today, I guess I'm principally interested in the convergence between the social sciences and the natural sciences. And I'm assuming that the audience I'm speaking to are environmental scientists of lots of different kinds. And I guess the multiple distinctions amongst those is probably something I'm not that aware of, but look forward to finding out more about today. I'm going to talk about Access, which you've just heard about, which is an ESRC funded, ESRC standing for Economic and Social Research Council funded 5-year network. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the work we've been doing in Access to try and skill up social scientists to be in a position to contribute to solving and addressing environmental challenges. And part of that is about giving people the skills to be able to effectively collaborate with people from other kinds of disciplinary expertise, like the environmental sciences. And I'll be talking about net zero, which is obviously one of the most crucial environmental challenges we face, and the findings of a task force which has been taking place over the last year, and the report is entitled "Making a Net Zero Society." So I'll tell you a bit more about all that, and look forward to hearing more from what you think. Well, I mean, I've already been introduced, so I'm not going to spend any time here, but just to say that principally myself, I've been working over the last 20 years or so in the area of low carbon energy transitions. And actually, a lot of this work is around technologies, innovative technologies, and technology transitions. But from a natural science point of view, it's interesting. A lot of this work has taken place in countryside areas, rural areas, coastal areas, and a lot of the social dimensions are about how we effectively transform landscapes and places in ways that actually bring communities with us rather than lead to so-called NIMBY hostility by people who do not want wind farms or various other projects to go ahead. More recently, looking at newer technical solutions like carbon capture, utilization and storage and hydrogen production, which are part of the government's net zero industrial decarbonisation agenda. I work with a variety of kind of theoretical approaches, principally drawn from the disciplines of environmental psychology and human geography. Central to that is considering ideas about acceptability and objection or resistance. And NIMBYism is one of the handles around that. Looking at ways to bring society or specifically local communities with us on the journey of low carbon energy transitions. How do you do that effectively and fairly? Thinking about technical change through the lens of place and landscape, people's connections, emotional bonds with places, and then finally, a bigger set of ideas to do with justice, fairness, and equity, which is crystallizing around the idea of just transition at the moment. It led to some recent research, for example, in Grangemouth in Scotland, with local communities directly impacted by plans for industrial decarbonisation. And I've never been the kind of academic who wanted to just sit in a room and write journal papers that end up on a library shelf. So I've been involved in a variety of different kind of mechanisms to try and not only do social science, but take it out there and make sure that people who need to know about it, who are making decisions or making policy, might actually be informed by it. And that's a general preoccupation of mine, particularly in the context of a climate environment emergency. So you've heard about this access thing. What's it all about? It's advancing capacity in climate and environment social science. It's a 5-year initiative. I'm the director, and we're about halfway through. The aim of Access is to provide leadership, to provide a positive vision for the contribution that the social sciences can make to solving environmental problems. And we're not saying that the social sciences are the only types of expertise we need. Clearly, it's an interdisciplinary space, and actually there are many different forms of knowledge that need to be brought about. But one of the starting points of Access is that social scientific knowledge and data and methods and insights are a crucial part of that jigsaw of an effective suite of evidence which can lead to policy response and decision making and good practice. So it's not the kind of initiative where we're writing lots and lots of journal papers in a sense, like a research center. What we are trying to do is to increase the visibility of social science amongst policymakers and practice audiences. And that's one of the reasons I'm speaking to you all today. We want to make better use of existing data and evidence. Social scientists are very good at writing new research projects, creating even more data sets when there's an awful lot out there already that maybe we need to be exploiting and utilizing a bit better than we do. We need to skill up people to be able to have effective contributions with people from other kinds of disciplinary or expertise domains. That's not necessarily easy to do. As someone who's taken part in large numbers of interdisciplinary research consortia over the last 15, 20 years, funded by NERC or ESRC, Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, it's actually very difficult to cross these boundaries sometimes, to build relationships of trust, to understand the words and the languages that other disciplines use. That doesn't happen overnight. But it requires certain skill sets, and we're trying to build that in this project. We're also trying to reduce fragmentation across the social science landscape. Now, this might not be something that's a preoccupation or an interest of many of you, but sociologists think differently to social psychologists, and social psychologists address problems differently to anthropologists or political scientists. And sometimes you just get a sense that social science is so heterogeneous that it's actually very difficult to see any cohesion in there. So one of our attempts is to try and improve coordination a little bit and bring people together. And finally, it's about challenging something I'm calling, or has been called, end-of-pipe social science, end-of-pipe social science, which is literally bringing the social scientists in at the very end of the process. And I'll come back to that because it's a long-standing challenge. Right, so what is social science anyway? I'm not assuming that everybody here is au fait with the terminology or the concepts, but I just thought I'd leave this as a dangling question at the beginning of this talk and maybe ask you to just write it down on a piece of paper you've got, or write it in the chat, whatever you feel comfortable with. But just take a couple of seconds and think, when you think of the word social science, what does it bring to mind, if anything? So I'll just leave you to do that for a few seconds. We probably won't have time during the talk to really consider your answers to these, but I think it's useful to just stop at the beginning and consider what are the kind of expectations or presuppositions or assumptions that you bring to this talk about what social science is, and what does environmental social science do then in that sense, which might be most relevant to this group. So, having kind of given you a little bit of early homework to do, I'm going to push on. So this is a series of remarks about why we think you need to know about environmental social science. And really it's because environmental problems can be characterized as human problems a lot of the time, in the sense that they're anthropogenically caused. But the importance of social science in explaining those environmental problems is not always recognized. It's not always clearly valued or visibly seen and understood. Sometimes the kind of people dimension is dismissed as kind of common sense. We kind of know that anyway. We know people are involved. Sometimes if it's there in practice or in research projects, it can be carried out by people who don't have proper training, and it's not necessarily always very well resourced in comparison to other parts of initiatives or interventions. It's often very limited in scope. And this comes back to that point I was making about the end of pipe issue about social science. Sometimes it only happens at the end of interventions. How do we get the users to accept the problem that we've come up with, the solution we've come up with to the problem that we've already defined. And social science happens at the end, and it's then issues about engagement or communication or public relations or acceptability, things like that. When actually, I guess one of my core claims would be, if you bring social science in earlier on in that process, interesting things can happen that might be beneficial for everybody. Sometimes people's views of the social dimensions of environmental problems can be based on really outdated or stereotypical or simply inaccurate thinking. Somebody was talking to me the other day about Mrs. Miggins, who's this notional kind of housewife who turns up sometimes in everyday discourse to explain why it's hard to do energy transitions or get people to change their behavior. And we have these kind of ideas that circulate in society about what people are like, or why people don't want to change, or why people don't get the answer, which we think is self-evident or good. And of course, there can be limited understanding, understandably, I think a lot of times, of social science theories, of the methods we can draw on, not just the kind of conventional ones like surveys or questionnaires. There's a whole panoply, a range of different approaches and ideas and concepts, and these aren't always known about. And that's not necessarily everyone else's problem. It might be that social scientists aren't necessarily particularly skilled or good at actually letting people know about what we can do and what we can offer. So there's a whole suite of challenges there. But if you had to reduce the social science contribution to three pillars, you could say, on the one hand, we could be useful. We can provide instrumental, practical insights to help you to do the things that you want to do anyway. And those are based on science-based evaluations of previous interventions. So there's some practice, some instrumental stuff going on there. We can help with evaluation, understanding. If an intervention took place and it was successful, why did it work? Because you need to know that if you're going to replicate funding or reproduce practices in the future. Why did it not work? What were the underlying reasons? And they may not be what you might think before you do any detailed analysis. And finally, and I think really importantly, there's this idea of a critical and innovative, fresh look at things. Sometimes the framing of the question in the beginning can be done in numerous ways, and bringing social scientists in at the beginning, sometimes that might be about challenging conventional thinking or seeing things from a different perspective, can be incredibly rewarding in a process of designing interventions or practices. It's worth thinking that through and designing effective processes that might be research that might be collaborative, or practices that might be to do with co-production or co-creation if you want to build a community and bring people with you. So there's a variety of reasons why you'd go looking for social science input in the first place, and these are just three. Yeah, so hopefully you've written a few things down in the chat or on your piece of paper at home or whatever. We won't go into that just now, but we'll come back to it at this time in the Q&A at about 1 o'clock. So I'm going to keep rattling through just in the interest of getting through some of my slides. So who's involved in Access? I've said that I'm involved. I'm the director from the University of University of Sussex, Exeter. What am I doing? The core team, our leadership team, is in the middle here. There's a range of different disciplines and social scientists, some of whom you might recognize the names of here, from Exeter, Surrey, Bath, Leeds, and Sussex. So we're a big group. We're a network, an expanding network. But one of the key things that makes Access different from most other university initiatives is that we actually have practice stakeholders from the nature agencies inside our leadership team. So that is the social research network of all of the different nature agencies, and there may well be people connected to those organizations on this webinar, I don't know. But that means that we're not just academics thinking theoretically or involved in theoretical debates. We actually have people involved in policy delivery, directly involved in our projects and kind of keeping our feet on the ground, so to speak, and also helping us to really understand how government actually works, how policy actually gets delivered on the ground, and what are the challenges on the ground in delivering policy and interventions around nature issues or environmental problems. And we're a growing network. So there's a kind of a signpost there. If you're interested in knowing more about Access, if you'd like to be part of it, if you'd like to join our partnership, then get in touch afterwards. How do we do our work? Well, I guess the first thing to say is that we have guiding principles. We started off with a concern that if we're going to try and represent environmental social science to the world or act as a champion for this kind of expertise, then we have to be seen to be walking the talk. And so that means taking care of our own sustainability credentials, being very cautious about how we travel to meetings or whether we fly off to the other side of the world in order to give a conference talk. What kind of impacts are we having ourselves in the course of our own project delivery? And then emphasizing things which are important in terms of how we do what we do in the sense of co-producing our findings, which means working closely with practice and policy partners, and being aware of that kind of more collaborative approach and thinking through the inclusion, diversity, equality issues about how we go about doing our work. And that often means thinking very carefully about capacity building in the course of our activities as well. In terms of how we engage with government, we have a policy and practice working group that meets quarterly. It's the second of these circles you can see, and there's a whole range of different government departments and devolved administrations and agencies and regulatory bodies on that. So this is how we communicate, we co-produce, we have quarterly meetings, as I said, and we try and stay in touch and learn from what they tell us and also inform them about what we're doing, as well as an international advisory board. And we're involved in a whole suite of activities in our 4 work packages, some of which are about training the next generation of environmental social scientists. We also have various things, which I'll tell you about in a minute, called a task force and a flexible fund where we fund innovative projects. And in our 4th work package, we try and communicate effectively. We have a website, we have an annual assembly, like a conference to bring people together. We've all kinds of different activities which are exciting and wonderful and keep us all very busy. So I just wanted to make a shout out for Ruth Lamont, who's the winner of one of our Flexible Fund awards. So our Flexible Fund basically is 20% of our grant from ESRC, a £1 million pot. And we've had 2 funding rounds over the last 3 years, trying to give the opportunity to build capacity in early career researchers and practice what we preach in terms of bringing together practitioners and academic researchers from different sectors. And I just wanted to highlight this one of the 9 round 1 awards. We have 12 Flex Fund awards altogether. So one of those 12 is this award given to Ruth Lamont from Natural England. And I think it was useful to signpost it here because it's designed to be a kind of resource guide for people working in environmental science contexts or environmental organizations. So it's available to download on the Natural England website. The link is there and you can see it, or we can share the link to this afterwards. But it's about supporting environmental scientists, environmental social scientists working in environmental organizations, and also supporting non-social scientists to learn more about what actually social science does and can do and can offer, and providing resources and support to enable that to happen. But the rest of the talk over the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to focus down on our first task force. Now, we've just started the second one, but I'm going to go back a year to the first one. So we're going to do roughly 3 of these in the course of our 5-year program. And the first one we decided to do on the tricky issue of net zero, which is a 2050 legal target to reach in the UK, of course, one of the first countries in the world to set that target. The second task force will be more environmentally focused and maybe of interest to this audience, to do with biodiversity loss and nature positivity, and I'll tell you something about that in a minute. But first, I just want to give you a brief idea of what is an Access Task Force, who was involved, and what did it achieve over the last year. The idea is to take a fresh look. It's to tackle a problem that we think would benefit from further social science contributions and understandings. And I think we were starting from a concern that when government often, at least, talks about net zero, it tends to talk about technologies, as if technologies are enough to get to net zero, and really wondering about what the socio-technical means, if people are aware of that term, which is the way in which you get an interplay between technological innovation and social innovation or social change. So we started with this idea that if we're going to reach net zero by 2050, we're likely to have to see societal transformations or social change. And what could that look like? And what kind of social science could you bring to bear to inform that? So we put together this team of about 10 or 12 experts, professors from around the UK, from different universities, different disciplines, and we had Environment Agency input from a more technical capacity from Pete Bailey and Katie Dow. So again, keeping to that access ethos of not just being academics working in silos or ivory towers, but trying to work across different partners and co-produce findings. The initiative did several different things over the year. We reviewed theories of societal change. We analysed government policy documents. We looked at past case studies of societal change, and you can see the list of them on the right there. They're very varied. Some of them showed examples of positive change. Some of them showed examples where initiatives actually fell apart or were opposed or objected to and didn't get anywhere and ran into a brick wall. We also engaged with a variety of organizations, some of which are named here, and some of which were governmental organizations. And we've also conducted a large-scale public opinion survey on net zero and governance and policy dimensions in particular. A small amount of the findings of that are mentioned in these slides, but we're still finalizing those set of results, and they will be made available on our website in due course. So I'm going to rattle through these very briefly, excuse me. First, we're going to I'm just going to say a very little thing about the analysis of these government policy documents. Now, these are net zero policy documents, but they're about research and innovation. And we focused in on these because they give us an idea of what the previous government, I guess, what they were thinking we need to know. What are the kind of research needs? What are the topics we need to have new evidence about? And that was of interest to us as social scientists because it would kind of give us a handle on what do they think are the gaps in evidence or the needs for knowledge that government thinks it has around net zero. And what we found was that although there was a lot of language in these reports and delivery plans about systems approaches, when it comes down to it, most of the emphasis was upon supply side technocentric solutions, big carbon capture, utilization and storage projects, big offshore wind, sectoral development, direct air capture, really some really quite untried and tested, but being considered to be deployed at huge scales. So great opportunity, but also great risk, you could say, involved in that. By comparison, much less emphasis upon reducing demand for energy in the first place, using less across all sectors, including the domestic context, even though there's quite a substantial social science body of evidence on this, not least an IPCC chapter in Working Group 3 that I was involved in the last assessment round, and a lot of analysis around how you avoid demand in the first place, how you can shift people into different kinds of ways of delivering services and also improve or make more efficient existing devices or service provision. So we know a lot about that, but we weren't seeing much of it in these reports. The framing of people or society was primarily as consumers working in markets rather than as citizens or communities or any other kind of collective. And there was a sense that if social science was recognized, it was helping us to find out how we can make these technological solutions more acceptable. So a nod towards that end of pipe social science I've been mentioning. And the final point to say is that you can see the unevenness in policy here because we also looked closely at a Government Office for Science foresight report called Net Zero Society, which had a very different flavor, and it used scenarios, it used modeling, but it also used deliberative engagement with publics to look ahead to the period of 2050 and imagine what for example, the intersection between fairness and equity and net zero delivery might look like. Emphases that were not as clear in the research and innovation frameworks and delivery plans at all. So it's not that government isn't aware of these, it's just that it's not clear in some documents, but in some bits of government, there's really advanced thinking on this, and we need to see that a lot more joined up and spread more widely. In terms of the rest of the task force, I mentioned we did all of those case studies, and I'm just going to pick out 3 highlight findings in the last 5 minutes before I stop. Number 1 is this idea about contestation and conflict. It is part of almost all of the examples of societal change that we looked at. So it should not be a surprise to anyone that the achievement of of policy goals or radical ideas is going to be smooth or uncontested, or the people who have an interest in the status quo might not kick up a fuss or try and prevent change, which might not be in their interest. So if you take that on board from the beginning and you imagine that conflict is inevitable to some degree in any process of societal transformation, then social science is actually really useful in providing understandings about why conflict does or does not occur. What are the reasons for that? And it might be inadequacies around engagement or consultation, people feeling that initiatives are being done to them rather than with them. It might be something to do with the way that the risks of change are being discussed and how transparently or openly they're being discussed, or the uncertainties involved in change are being openly recognized. Whether there's any legitimacy recognized in public concerns or not, or people are simply ridiculed as being NIMBYs that are getting in the way of progress, and how much dialogue or consensus is prevented by really in-depth mistrust of politicians or people in big business and vested interests who are maybe incumbents with very little reasons to accept change or promote change. There's also a lot of social science on the way in which you can mobilize dialogue mechanisms, participatory approaches, deliberative engagement, for example, that can be very useful early in processes of transformation to identify areas of contestation, to anticipate unintended consequences, and to build, as far as possible, collective visions of change. And we know from many, many examples in the past that if these kinds of engagement mechanisms are well designed and resourced, then they can complement existing representative politics and bring in a multitude of different voices and perhaps legitimize processes of change that might not be seen to be that legitimate otherwise. Secondly, there's an interesting set of findings in the report about what we call mid-level actors. And here we're really trying to get away from very simple ideas about change to do with top-down kind of steering by the government, a kind of heavy hand from above, or a very kind of crude bottom-up idea that society is composed of lots of individuals and that just kind of changed things from below. Instead, we thought it was quite useful to actually focus on the interesting role that could be played by what we call mid-level actors. And these could be based at the local level, the place-based level. They might be local councils, they might be local businesses or schools or non-governmental organizations like community energy groups or environmental initiatives or wildlife trusts. But the point is that these are actors that can sit between the individual and the household and the state. They can form effective networks, they can build alliances and partnerships, and that can be really important in mobilizing different groups to achieve change and to kind of intercede between those high-level government targets like the 2050 net zero target and the kind of substantial changes on the ground that are really the only way that we're going to actually reach those kinds of challenging policy targets. And you can see some of the blue font here are some of the findings from the survey that we did across the UK. And there's lots of public concern basically about the extent to which either top-down or bottom-up is really an effective means of creating change. And there is at least some support for more participatory approaches and for people having just a bit more involvement, a bit more of a say in policy on net zero and climate. Finally, I just want to talk about what we call galvanizing issues, because we found that sometimes it's better to try and bring diverse groups in society together around an issue which isn't actually primarily environmental. And we've seen in the past that, for example, sometimes reframing an issue around this galvanizing topic can be a way of shifting it into a different realm and making it mean something else. And there could be something interesting here in terms of net zero around the idea of co-benefits. We know that, for example, getting people out of the car is good because there are a whole raft of physical health and mental well-being benefits that might come from that. There might be positive impacts on pollution levels or the extent of wildlife around in people's areas and neighborhoods or green space. So shifting the focus away from a very maybe a contentious topic like net zero or a challenging environmental solution into other realms can bring different kind of disparate actors together and be a part of any process of change, which is bringing diverse actors together. And again, that's shown through plenty of examples in the report that I would signpost you to. So in sum, the key recommendations of the task force report on net zero was about saying that, yes, the public are behind it, but there's lots of conditions to that public support. It depends on addressing existing financial hurdles. It depends on the transition being perceived as fair and equitable across all parts of society. It depends on people feeling like they actually have a say in this process of change rather than just being done to them in a top-down manner. And the social sciences have a lot to say about these processes of social change and transformation, about how dialogue can be enabled, about how conflict plays out. And this knowledge can support practice and government and decision makers in all kinds of ways, but it needs to be mobilized at the right time. And as I said, frequently, often it's brought in a bit too late. So I just wanted to finish by highlighting that that task force has just produced its outputs, and we've already started the next one. And the next one will be of great interest, I think, to this audience because it's about biodiversity loss. It's being led by Professor Michael Winter of the University of Exeter, with experts drawn from practice and from university contexts. So a really interesting team of people being brought together. And more information about that will be made available on our Access website in due course, and it will be reporting its findings towards the end of 2025. So maybe there's an opportunity for Michael to come back and speak to you at a future date. So I just wanted to finish with some conclusions that I think are part and parcel of this idea of these webinars about creating spaces for interdisciplinary dialogue, collaborations, etc. We are in a context of environment and climate emergency. It's pretty scary, and we all need to face up to it. It's going to require rapid societal and technological transformations in our personal lives, in our professional lives, in our community interests, in all facets of what we do on a day-to-day basis in our lives. And it's going to need robust evidence and diverse forms of knowledge. And that's why environmental sciences are crucial, and social sciences as well. We need academic research that is relevant to, but also, where appropriate, critical of policy and practice. We need researchers who are skilled at collaborating across disciplinary boundaries. Otherwise, we're not going to get that effective cooperation across different disciplines. We need more and better engagement between research and policy and practice, these disparate worlds and communities that often don't speak to each other or at cross purposes. And as I said, I think finally we need a bit less end-of-pipe social science where we bring these insights to bear and these experts to bear a bit earlier in the process for mutual benefit. So if any of that was of interest to you, and I hope it was, then have a look at our website and all the resources that are available on it. You can download the Making a Net Zero Society report. We've got a summary and a full report version. You can get in touch with me by email. You can take a look at our website. You can sign up to our weekly newsletter, which is thrilling and full of interesting social science. But I'm going to stop there and thank you for your attention. And if there's time for some Q&A, then great.
Oh, thank you so much, Patrick. That was a really fascinating overview of the project. And it's really interesting to see a lot of parallels between kind of conversations that are going on in the social sciences and conversations going on in the environmental sciences as well. So that's really useful to see. Yes, so to all our attendees, please do put your questions for Patrick in the Q&A box. We're going to kick straight off into some questions now. So first up, I was quite struck with you mentioned that there can be quite a lot of barriers between different specialisms within the social sciences, and that's very much aligned with what we talk about a lot in the environmental sciences as well, and difficulties in bridging those gaps. So I wonder if you could expand a little bit more on what you think is kind of a key success factor in bridging some of those gaps, and particularly you mentioned skill sets for interdisciplinary collaboration. Could you expand on that a little bit, please?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think one of I've been in social science long enough to actually have skipped from one discipline to another. So all of my formative training is in the discipline of psychology. I have a PhD in social psychology and MSc in environmental psychology, but I've ended up in a geography department. And geography is a really interesting discipline because it brings together the science side of physical geography and the human, cultural, social side of the social side. So basically, what I learned in my academic trajectory is that no one discipline has all of the knowledge that we need. Doesn't have all the answers. You need to start with some humility that your take on the solution is only one small slice of a bigger pie. And therefore, you need other people's expertise in order to solve these problems. So straight away, then you're in a context of being a bit careful about the claims you make about we can solve the problem. Our discipline is uniquely able to do this, that, and the other, which it probably is, but it's not all of it. And therefore, then starting to think about having effective collaborations with other kinds of experts and other kinds of disciplines. Now, I've been involved in lots and lots of Research Council funded academic projects where they've all aspired to reaching across disciplinary boundaries, but mostly they don't. It's not just not very effectively done. It is a very difficult thing to do in practice. So I'm not going to begin to say that it's easy, but it needs to start from an interest in what other people are doing, what other disciplines are doing, a respect, an enthusiasm for the other perspective. And then a challenge of crossing language barriers, of breaking down the jargon that each of us use normally, penetrating that, finding a way of communicating with each other. And I think the situation, at least in academia, is much better than it was in the sense that there are now lots of, I would say, kind of prestigious interdisciplinary journals to do with nature and sustainability, whereas before it was very disciplinary silo based. So you can publish in Nature now, or you can publish in other kind of formats where bringing together different knowledges is more acceptable than it was. And also there's much more of an emphasis upon impact now in universities and research assessment exercises. But it's hard to do. I mean, listen, it's hard to bring the social sciences together. A lot of mind jumping outside. So I wouldn't say it's easy. But I'm absolutely convinced that we need to do this in order to solve the environmental challenges we face. We just need to get on with it and realize that it's important.
Thank you. And yeah, I mean, I echo everything you said, really. Like I said, at the IES, we've been exploring similar kinds of conversations and we launched an inaugural conference this year called Dialogue Between Disciplines, which is kind of
Uh-huh.
based around bringing different disciplines together. So hopefully we can continue these conversations a little bit.
Yeah.
Just another question from an attendee here saying that they've recently graduated with an environmental science degree, um, but they're finding it hard to find a job where they'll feel able to make a difference. Do you have any advice in getting into the environmental field or any kind of key courses or volunteering I should be involved in to kind of build some of these skills that you've been talking about?
Hmm. Okay. Well, I mean, I think there's a whole raft of NGO organizations out there that are probably desperate for someone with your skills and expertise. So obviously, that's not necessarily a straightforward answer for you because you need to pay the bills, but there will be organizations out there that are to do with environmental conservation, that might be to do with community energy initiatives, and they need people with energy and skills and expertise to join them and to help them to do what they do. So that's really useful in terms of gaining experience. And then you might think through other ways of moving forward with your career. So I think that could be one useful way to think about it. And there are lots and lots of different kind of postgraduate courses out there that you can do through distance learning, online courses. So there's lots of opportunity there. But yeah, so good luck. See what you can do, but plenty of opportunity.
I'd agree with that. And what you're already doing, engaging with professional bodies is a really great way of helping with your career. If you look on our website, there's a lot of kind of career resources. And staying up to date with what's going on in the sector through things like this webinar and kind of building your thinking, I think is really important. And then the specific things around mentoring and all of those types of things. So do take a look at our career pages. Sorry, a little plug there. Great. Moving on to the next questions. Um, how can interdisciplinary thinkers get involved in some of these task groups? Do you need to have 20 years of niche expertise to add to these kinds of conversations?
Ooh. Look, I wouldn't be putting down 20 years of niche experience, but yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the kind of initiative that you're doing. The aim of the task forces in Access is to draw on the social science evidence base that we have, kind of in a way package it and then get it out there because we think people don't know what's out there. I mean, there are so many structural barriers to accessing social science expertise. There's the language in the journals I've just described, but then you have to have subscriptions to the journals in the first place, and they're only written with other social science experts as the target audience. They're not written for anyone else in mind, so they're not appropriate to reach society or other types of domains of expertise. So there's huge barriers there to communication. But I think first and foremost, the Access Task Forces at least are to just try and summarize what we already know and get that out there. But I think there are a lot of initiatives in this domain at the moment, and there will be opportunities to contribute to those. There will be consultations, there'll be calls for evidence. And when those come around, then they are brilliant opportunities to feed back what you think of interim findings and contribute in that way. So I think there are lots of opportunities.
Definitely. Thank you, Patrick. And I was really interested in a point you raised around kind of mid-level actors and their role in some of this, some of these areas. Do you see professional bodies sitting within that area as well? And I saw that you were engaging with professional bodies as part of the one of the working groups.
Yeah.
What role do you see professional bodies having in this space?
Well, I think professional bodies are really important because we know from social science evidence that they're more likely to be trusted by members of the public as people with experts guiding, evidence or what kind of interventions or policy should be driven around future environmental problems and change in those regards. So we need experts, we need strong disciplines, and I think reaching professional organizations is really important there. The question is, what do we as members of those professional organizations do with our expertise? And I think, as I mentioned, I'm already tired of academics who just write more journal papers and don't try and get the knowledge out there. And that's what Access is trying to do. It sounds as if IES is in exactly the same space about taking a set of expertise, disciplinary expertise, practical expertise, and trying to share it and get it out there. And I think we need more of these kind of intermediaries or networks to be built to form strong alliances and partnerships and then work together to try and solve these problems. The other reason why I think that can be very effective is that I think government sometimes gets overwhelmed by so many different actors coming to them saying, we're experts, here's our take on the solution. And they're faced with 10 or 12 different reports, all more or less on the same, saying, but if you can bring that together, if you can kind of convene shared spaces and convene communities of expertise together, I think it's a more likely to be more effective at influencing decision makers or influencing policy, because it's less work for them then, in a sense, in terms of working out, well, how do we put of this together? So I think those kind of partnerships are really important. And yes, I think in terms of the mid-level actor point, it's really about filling that huge space that's existed for the last 5 or 10 years between the idea of the public as individual consumers and government setting big, 2050 targets, etc. And there is absolutely a role for all of us in our local places and neighborhoods, but also in our professional networks to be bringing people together or pointing out what the expertise that we have means in terms of tackling change. And as I said, we are fortunate in having far more trust than people in large, big business organizations or people in government, elected representatives. So let's use that position of trust in society as far as it exists to get the word out about what we think should be happening.
I couldn't agree more with all of that, Patrick, and thank you so much for your presentation today. It was really interesting, and I hope that we can kind of continue these conversations, as I've said. And it would be interesting to hear about the next task force as well and some of their work that's being done. I just wanted to mention, I kind of touched on it briefly, but for our attendees as well, here at the IES, we are really strong advocates for interdisciplinary collaboration to drive action for people and nature. And actually, this time last year, we published our Transforming the Planet, our vision for the future of environmental sciences, that does provide a bit more detail on the importance of interdisciplinarity, along with more information on how we can achieve a positive future. I'm just going to put a link to that in the chat for anyone that's interested in reading a bit more about that. In terms of the next IES event, so that's going to be taking place on the 26th of November, and that's going to be a bit more specific and is focused on the day in the life of a land condition professional, and you can register for this on our website. If you are an IES member, please don't forget to record your attendance at this webinar using our CPD tool, and you can do this by logging into the members area of the website. And if you've enjoyed today's webinar and you're not a member, please do consider joining the IES. And thank you, just a massive thank you to all our attendees for coming and kind of engaging with this topic, and most of all to you, Patrick, for sharing this information. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers, everybody. Bye-bye now.